The faint scent of cedar and aged leather filled the study. Caleb Thorne tapped a pen against the polished mahogany desk, his gaze fixed on the man stuffing a gourmet chocolate chip cookie into his mouth. He remarked that he had summoned Leo for a reason, and it wasn't to raid his private stash of snacks. Leo, without looking up, mumbled around a mouthful of cookie. He replied that he was well aware any summons from Caleb was unlikely to be for a pleasant reason, so he was preemptively compensating himself for the inevitable emotional distress. Caleb dismissed his antics, pulling a heavy silver signet ring from his jacket pocket and placing it on the desk between them. He asked Leo to take a look and tell him what was so special about it. He couldn't understand why everyone in Julian's circle reacted so strangely upon seeing it. Leo choked, coughing violently before pointing a trembling finger at the object. His eyes were wide with disbelief as he sputtered. Caleb, leaning back with a languid grace, studied his cousin-in-law's dramatic display, noting that yes, that was precisely the reaction he was talking about. Leo wanted to know where in the hell Caleb had stolen it from. Caleb's expression remained impassive. He stated flatly that Julian Vance had given it to him personally. This information did little to calm Leo. He demanded to know which Julian Vance, as if there could be any other. Caleb reminded him that he knew perfectly well how many cousins he had. Leo could only stare, incredulous, wondering aloud if his cousin had lost his mind. Caleb cut him off, his voice edged with impatience, and told him to get to the point. Leo took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair to calm himself. He explained that he remembered the ring belonging to their aunt, Julian's mother. Julian had worn it constantly since he was a boy. Caleb raised a skeptical eyebrow, questioning the certainty of that. He pointed out that Julian had once used it as collateral in a high-stakes poker game. If it was truly so important, he doubted Julian would have been so willing to part with it. Leo scoffed, asserting that Caleb didn't understand. He had seen Julian's chief of staff, a man named White, use the ring as a form of identification on several occasions. He explained that for anyone with connections to the Vance family, the ring was as good as Julian himself being present. Even if he lost it in a game, no one would dare keep it. It would inevitably find its way back to him. Caleb's lips curved into a faint smile. He mused aloud if it was a case of the ring being the man. Leo quickly added that just because Julian had given it to him, Caleb shouldn't get any ideas about using it to command the Vance family's considerable influence. Caleb glanced at Leo, who for once seemed to be thinking strategically. Leo's eyes were glued to the ring as he took a vengeful bite of another cookie, his next words a frustrated whine. He couldn't believe his cousin would give the ring to Caleb but had never once offered it to him. Caleb confessed he couldn't figure it out either. He picked up the ring, turning it over in his fingers. He supposed, uncertainly, that perhaps Julian had nothing else of value on him at the time, or maybe he was planning. Leo suddenly interrupted, his tone uncharacteristically serious. He told Caleb that he didn't know the first thing about the kind of political battles they fought in Washington. But setting all that aside, his cousin wasn't the cynical schemer Caleb imagined him to be. That ring, he insisted, was genuinely important to him. Caleb gave a non-committal hum, remarking that Leo had always been in Julian's corner, acting as if Julian were his own brother. He carelessly held the ring up to the light, admiring the way the polished silver caught the glow from the desk lamp. A cool, detached smile touched his lips, and without any, he opened his hand. How important could it be? He didn't particularly care for it. The heavy silver hit the marble floor with a sharp, clear ring that echoed in the quiet room. Leo froze for a second before slamming his hands on the desk and jumping to his feet, his face red with anger. He demanded to know if Caleb was insane. He lunged forward to retrieve the ring, but Caleb blocked him with an elegantly shod foot. Leo straightened up abruptly, his voice tight with fury as he asked what he thought he was doing. Caleb rested his arms on the desk, tilting his head with a lazy smile. He pointed out that it was a gift to him, so what business was it of Leo's to pick it up? Leo glared, asking if he could have it if Caleb didn't want it. Caleb's response was a slow, deliberate negative. Leo swore under his breath and spun around, heading for the door. As he passed Caleb's chair, he hissed that Caleb was an ungrateful bastard who didn't know how to appreciate a genuine gesture and would one day get what he deserved. Caleb watched him go with an amused glint in his eye, cheerfully calling out that he'd be happy to. Leo slammed the door behind him. Silence descended upon the room once more. Caleb's smile faded. He slowly finished the cup of cold tea on his desk, then rose and walked towards the door. But he stopped abruptly at the threshold, unable to take another step. He stood there silently, his hand resting on the carved oak panel, his gaze lost in some unseen distance. The last of the afternoon sun slanted through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. After a long moment, he slowly turned back, his expression unreadable as he stared at the spot where the ring lay. His eyes were a storm of conflicting thoughts. He walked back, bent down, and picked up the object at his feet. The signet was intact, but a web of hairline fractures now marred its surface, starkly visible in the fading light. Caleb clicked his tongue in annoyance, a frown creasing his brow, and shoved the ring back into his pocket. What a nuisance! A voice bellowed Julian, as the door to the Attorney General's office was thrown open with force. Julian Vance looked up from his papers at the furious figure of his cousin storming towards him. A small smile touched his lips as he asked if Leo was there to pick a fight with him. Leo shot back that he was there to get Julian to pick a fight with someone else. He slapped his hands on the desk, exclaiming that the bastard Caleb Thorne had thrown his ring. Julian's pen paused mid-sentence. He asked what ring Leo was talking about. Leo clarified that he meant the signet ring Julian had given him. He said Caleb had claimed he didn't care for it and just tossed it on the floor, adding that he, for one, would have cherished it. Julian set his pen down, his brow furrowing slightly. He told Leo to calm down and speak clearly. After a moment, a low chuckle escaped him. He murmured that if it was thrown, then so be it. Leo was flabbergasted by his calm reaction. He demanded to know if Julian wasn't going to say anything. Julian looked at him, asking what he was supposed to say. Leo insisted he should at least acknowledge that Caleb's behavior was outrageous. He started to call Caleb a piece of work, but Julian interrupted him. With a gentle smile, he told his cousin there was no need to speak of others so harshly. Leo blurted out that it was hardly slander, but seeing Julian's unconcerned expression, he felt his own anger dissipate. He lowered his voice and asked if the ring wasn't truly important to him, and why he had given it to Caleb in the first place. Julian's gaze softened as he looked down, a faint smile on his lips. Whether it was important or not didn't matter, he said softly. He explained that it was something he felt he should give to him, so he did. Leo didn't understand what he meant. Julian looked at his cousin and sighed softly. He elaborated that since he had already given it to Caleb, it was now Caleb's property. Whether he stored it carefully or threw it away was entirely up to him. Leo protested that it was one thing for his intentions to be questioned, but for the gift to be thrown away was another. He grumbled that all the kindness Julian showed Caleb was utterly wasted. Julian calmly advised him not to be so resentful. He explained that he had given it willingly, not with the expectation of receiving anything in return. He had never considered what purpose it might serve, and frankly, he had anticipated such an outcome, so it wasn't a great surprise. He told Leo not to worry about it so much. With a placid smile, he repeated that if it was thrown, it was thrown. Frustrated, Leo stared at Julian for a long moment before sighing in exasperation. He conceded the point, agreeing not to badmouth Caleb anymore. He couldn't help muttering that it was a shame to see such a fine piece of silver treated so poorly. He would have taken much better care of it. Julian chuckled, asking if he was supposed to believe that. He reminded Leo that, from childhood on, any gift he'd given him rarely survived for more than 3 days before being broken. Leo insisted he was just a kid back then and didn't know any better. He promised that if Julian gave him something now, he would treasure it. His eyes suddenly lit up, and he leaned in conspiratorially. He asked if Julian could give him a signet ring too, promising to keep it safe and polished. Julian shook his head, saying there were no more. When Leo pressed him, asking if he was sure, Julian's smile became a little wistful. He looked towards the window, at the shifting clouds against the D.C. skyline, his expression gentle. He explained in a low voice that his mother had left him only the one to give to someone. Leo followed his gaze out the window and fell silent, never bringing up the subject again. The cherry blossoms had come and gone. Spring was deepening, and with it, the date for the crucial diplomatic summit drew near. Attorney General Julian Vance, known for his meticulous and reliable nature, spent days arranging his affairs for his absence. He then drafted a formal proposal and went to the White House for the president's approval. President Sterling gave the document a cursory glance and nodded. He trusted the Attorney General's judgment completely. He set the proposal aside, noting that it seemed Julian had something else on his mind. Julian confirmed that he did. He then made a formal request for the president to temporarily grant him command authority over the National Guard forces in the southern sector. President Sterling was taken aback, repeating the phrase Southern Sector Command Authority as a question. Julian explained that he had received intelligence several days prior. After looking into it, he found that while the case against the secessionist governor of Louisiana, Broussard, was solid, there were too many unanswered questions. He suspected a trap and believed Broussard would not surrender peacefully. Broussard commanded a well-armed and loyal state militia, far superior to the federal marshals accompanying Julian. With the National Guard at his disposal, he would be better prepared for any sudden developments. Julian assured the president that upon his return to Washington, he would immediately relinquish the authority without any delay. President Sterling smiled, telling Julian that such explanations were unnecessary. He had never doubted his loyalty. However, he sighed, there was a complication. He reminded Julian that the command codes were not in his, the president's, hands. Even if he approved the request, it was uncertain whether Secretary Thorne would hand them over. Julian reassured the president that he needn't worry. He would go to the Pentagon and speak with Secretary Thorne personally. He was confident Thorne wouldn't defy a direct presidential order. He added that if this presented an opportunity to reclaim control of the codes, it would be the best possible outcome. President Sterling agreed, but another worry surfaced. He wondered what would happen if, during Julian's extended absence from the capital, Secretary Thorne decided to make a move. Julian's eyes darkened slightly. He confessed that was precisely his intention. When the president asked what he meant, Julian lowered his gaze, speaking slowly and deliberately. He stated that, as the president had surmised, with him out of the city, Secretary Thorne would feel far less constrained. They could use this opportunity to see what his true ambitions were. Besides, Louisiana wasn't so far away. If a major crisis erupted, he could be back in D.C. within hours. The president mused on the idea of this being a test, and after a moment's thought, he gave his consent. In his vast office, Caleb Thorne leaned back in his chair, listening with an air of relaxed indifference as Julian Vance stated his purpose. When he was finished, Caleb simply nodded, remarking that the matter was of grave importance, so of course, he would cooperate. He offered to write a letter of authorization immediately, which Julian could present to the commanding officer on site. Julian reminded him that, by protocol, a commanding officer required the official command codes to transfer authority. Caleb, already spreading a sheet of paper, acknowledged that he knew that. He explained that for security reasons, the codes weren't kept in his office. Given the tight schedule of Julian's departure, retrieving them would cause a delay of several days. He assured him that a signed directive would be just as effective. He paused, looking up at Julian with a sly curl of his lips. He added that besides, those cold, impersonal codes couldn't compare to a personal letter from him. Seeing his signature every day might even make the Attorney General think of him more often. The refusal was clear. Julian, having anticipated this, didn't press the issue. He managed a weary smile at the last remark, commenting that even without the letter, he found it quite difficult not to think of Secretary Thorne. Caleb's smile widened. As he handed the letter over, he purposefully let his hand close over Julian's. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, suggestive murmur, proposing that since that was the case, perhaps Julian should skip going home tonight and stay with him instead. Julian smoothly withdrew his hand and took a step back, avoiding Caleb's gaze. He replied with a polite, distant smile that Secretary Thorne was a busy man, and he wouldn't want to be a distraction. Caleb retracted his hand, a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. He then asked if Julian had made all the necessary arrangements in D.C., considering his trip to Louisiana would likely keep him away for at least a month and a half. Julian glanced at him, stating that the complexities of Washington politics made it impossible to arrange for every contingency. But, he added, with Secretary Thorne holding the fort, he had nothing to worry about. Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly, understanding the implication. A slow smile spread across his face. He replied that, with such a vote of confidence, it seemed he would have to be on his best behavior. Julian didn't respond. He examined the letter in his hand, then suddenly asked a hypothetical question. He wondered, if a commanding officer were presented with both a written order and the official command codes from Secretary Thorne, which one would they obey? Caleb rested his chin on his hand, his eyes fixed on Julian as he smiled slowly. He countered by asking why one would need to distinguish between the two, since both the letter and the codes originated from him and would never contain conflicting orders. Julian met his gaze, a serene smile playing on his lips. He said it was nothing, just a stray thought. Outside, a light rain had begun to fall, shrouding the late afternoon in a gray mist. A cool breeze drifted through the open door, yet Julian could still feel the phantom warmth of Caleb's palm on his skin. He took a deep breath, steadying a flutter in his chest. He turned back for one last look at the imposing facade of the Pentagon, then glanced down at the letter in his sleeve. He sighed softly. It seemed the Southern forces had all sworn allegiance to a new master. In early March, the Attorney General, acting on presidential orders, embarked on a mission to investigate the affairs of the southern states. The sun was bright, surrounded by fluffy spring clouds. President Sterling, accompanied by his entire cabinet and congressional leaders, saw him off at Andrews Air Force Base. Flags snapped in the wind, the honor guard stood with imposing dignity, and the roar of jet engines filled the air before settling into a low hum. A ceremonial toast was made, the champagne splashing onto the tarmac and releasing a rich aroma. Julian knelt, received the official documents from the president, and then rose to his feet with a respectful nod. The ceremony concluded. President Sterling looked at him intently for a moment, advising him to be careful on his journey. Julian thanked him for his concern. Behind him, his team began to board the aircraft. Julian bid farewell to the president and turned to walk towards the plane. As he passed Caleb Thorne, he couldn't help but glance at him, only to find Caleb's gaze already locked on him, his eyes as deep and inscrutable as the ocean. Caleb suddenly reached out and grabbed his arm. He stated, his voice devoid of emotion, not to get himself killed out there. The words were spoken so softly that only a few nearby officials overheard, their expressions instantly becoming a study in awkwardness. Julian was momentarily stunned, unable to decipher Caleb's meaning. Recalling Caleb's uncharacteristic silence earlier that morning, he managed a casual smile and assured him that he wouldn't. Julian's wrist was slender, and Caleb found himself tightening his grip slightly without realizing it. He stared at the man's smiling face, a slow smile of his own forming on his lips. He leaned in close, his mouth right next to Julian's ear, and whispered for him to be sure to come back soon, lest he waste away from longing. Julian's body went rigid. He turned his head, their faces mere inches apart. For a moment, the usually reserved and discreet Attorney General forgot they were in public, surrounded by the entire leadership of the country. He heard nothing but the frantic drumming of his own heart. For once, he didn't pull away. He simply lowered his gaze and whispered a single soft word. "All right." The word was warm, like jade falling on a bed of flowers. The weeks passed. After Julian's departure, Caleb Thorne's political faction remained surprisingly quiet. Government departments operated as usual, and an unexpected calm settled over Washington. While the political establishment breathed a collective sigh of relief, they also held their breath in suspicion, finding the tranquility deeply strange. This tense peace lasted for nearly a month. News came of the resolution in Louisiana, followed by reports that the Attorney General was preparing to return. It was only then that everyone realized Caleb Thorne had genuinely been a model of civic duty for the entire period. His decisions were impartial, his conduct beyond reproach, though it was noted that the Secretary of Defense had seemed unusually irritable lately. Caleb propped his head on one hand, tossing a report onto his desk. Hearing approaching footsteps, he asked without looking up if there was any news from Julian's team. The footsteps stopped abruptly. It was Marcus, and his voice held a strange note as he addressed his boss. Caleb lifted his gaze. Marcus looked at him with an odd expression, hesitating for a moment before pointing out that Caleb had already asked that same question 7 times in the last 2 days. Caleb frowned slightly, wondering if that was true. He then seamlessly continued, his tone unchanged, asking how it was possible that he had asked 7 times and there was still no new information. Marcus explained that Julian was on his way back and, since there had been no incidents, there was naturally no news to report. Caleb nodded, his face a blank mask. Marcus stepped forward and placed a file on the desk, reporting that it was from their operative in the Western Territories. The situation there was now under control. Caleb acknowledged it with a grunt. Marcus suddenly paused and took a deep breath. His gaze shifted to the small, elegant diffuser on the corner of the desk, from which a thin, almost invisible stream of vapor rose. He expressed surprise, asking if Caleb had changed the aromatherapy oil. Caleb glanced at it, confirming that it was a calming blend and asking for his opinion. Marcus said it was nice. Caleb tapped his fingers on the desk, remarking that he felt something was missing, that the scent was too cold and bland. Marcus pointed out that calming blends were supposed to smell that way. Kaylee stared at the diffuser and replied instinctively that the ones he had smelled before weren't like this. Marcus asked where he had smelled it before. A name hovered on the tip of Caleb's tongue, but he caught himself. He blinked, shaking himself out of his reverie, and waved a dismissive hand, mumbling a vague answer. After giving his report, Marcus left. Outside, a spring rain pattered against the windows. Inside, the warm, scented mist seemed to intertwine with unspoken thoughts. Caleb leaned back in his chair. After a moment, he picked up the report again, his eyes scanning the words one by one with a feigned carelessness. It was the final update from the agent assigned to Julian's detail. It stated that Julian had departed Louisiana, and everything was proceeding smoothly. Everything was proceeding smoothly. The past month, including the resolution of the Governor Broussard case, had been smooth, unsettlingly smooth. Initially, upon Julian's arrival, Governor Broussard had refused to meet him, barricading himself in the state capitol. He had even deployed his private militia throughout the city, creating a tense standoff with the National Guard units Julian had brought. The situation had grown more volatile by the day, a powder keg waiting for a spark. Then, overnight, everything changed. The entire militia surrendered their weapons. The massive capitol doors swung open. In the cold moonlight, a man emerged barefoot, holding a signed confession. He identified himself as Broussard's chief strategist. He claimed he had been coerced into aiding the governor's treasonous plans and had been tormented by his conscience. Seeing that Broussard's madness was about to endanger the entire state, he had conspired with others to assassinate him. Now he had come to welcome the Attorney General. Kneeling before the imposing building, he confessed to everything. Using a network of fentanyl labs to control a key senator, establishing a high-end blackmail club in D.C., hiring an assassin to eliminate federal officials, and helping Broussard sow chaos. He claimed all the venomous plots were his own creation. He knew he faced the death penalty and accepted that a life for a life was just. His only plea was for Julian to show mercy to the loyal but ignorant soldiers and the innocent citizens of the state. His speech was powerful and resonant. When he finished, he bowed his head to the ground. Behind him, some of the militiamen had tears in their eyes. Even members of Julian's entourage were visibly moved. Julian, however, remained impassive as he looked at the evidence photos of Broussard's head, the face contorted in a final rictus of fury and disbelief, grotesque in the dim light. After a long silence, Julian spoke, his voice calm. He asked who had ever said he wanted Governor Broussard dead. The strategist looked up and began listing Broussard's 10 greatest crimes, each one unforgivable, proving him a man devoid of loyalty, humanity, and conscience. He was a menace who deserved to be eliminated by anyone. Julian watched him silently for a moment, then gave a faint, enigmatic smile and said no more. The state was temporarily placed under the authority of the National Guard commander. After securing the evidence, Julian did not rush to leave. He ordered a statewide search, uncovering hundreds of acres of fentanyl production facilities disguised as farms. He personally supervised as they were all set ablaze. On the last day, the strategist suddenly requested a meeting. He bowed deeply to Julian, repeating his plea to spare the innocent. Then he turned and leaped into the massive, roaring pyre of burning chemicals beside them. The flames surged, and his figure was instantly consumed, turning to ash. The people of the city marveled, saying the strategist was not a villain after all, but a man of honor and righteousness. Caleb snorted in derision. Amidst the chaos of that day, the agent had paid close attention to Julian's reaction. Shielded by his security detail, the Attorney General had only shown a flicker of surprise, a slight frown, and then a soft, unreadable chuckle. Others might not have understood Julian's reaction, but Caleb did. The primary target was dead before he could be properly interrogated, cutting off any chance of a thorough investigation. The strategist's confession was a mix of truth and lies that could no longer be verified. And by committing suicide before he could be returned to D.C., he had created another perfect dead end. On the surface, the case was a success, even adorned with a touch of heroic tragedy. But in reality, all they had was a corpse, a pile of ashes, and nothing more. Julian had faced no real danger. It was not the elaborate trap they had anticipated. The conflict between the solid evidence against Broussard and his questionable motives had only deepened, and now the trail was completely cold. If they weren't just being paranoid, then the only other possibility was that things were far more complicated than they appeared. Doubt bloomed, but there were no answers. Caleb stared at the crisp white paper, his gaze unconsciously settling on the typed name. The ink formed the elegant letters of a name that seemed to embody a quiet strength. He could almost imagine the humid southern breeze weaving through Julian's fingers, the flutter of his coat, a faint, knowing smile on his lips as the fiery pyre blazed before him like a million butterfly wings taking flight. A man of boundless grace. Come back soon, lest I waste away from longing. It had been a completely impulsive, throwaway joke. Outside, the spring rain grew heavier, drumming a steady rhythm on the leaves. Caleb suddenly doused the diffuser with a glass of ice water, tossed the report back on the desk, and pressed his fingers to his temples. Lovesick. What a joke. Who would actually miss him? A few days later, Washington, D.C. didn't welcome back the Attorney General, but instead received an unprecedented visitor. A Russian delegation arrived, led by none other than Dmitry Volkov, the ninth son of a powerful oligarch. Since the new administration had taken office, tensions between the United States and Russia had been constant. Countless lives had been lost in proxy wars across the globe. Even the mention of Russia was enough to stir resentment among the American public. Although Caleb Thorne's formidable military reputation had kept Russia from making any overt moves in recent years, the border regions remained on high alert, with no diplomatic exchange. Now, Russia had suddenly sent a high-profile envoy. The administration, shocked, scrambled to receive him with proper diplomatic courtesy, determined not to lose face. Dmitry Volkov's English was surprisingly fluent. In a meeting in the cabinet room, after a perfunctory greeting, he got straight to the point. Russia demanded that the United States cede control of 5 strategic naval bases in the Arctic. The Russian attitude was arrogant, clearly taking advantage of America's strained relations with China to press for concessions. The young Volkov was a skilled orator, weaving a compelling argument from logic to emotion. An awkward silence fell over the room. The cabinet members exchanged uneasy glances. After a moment, President Sterling spoke, asking if he was to understand that, after the ceding of the 5 bases, Russia would guarantee an end to all hostilities. Dmitry smiled, assuring him they would. He explained that Russia held no real animosity towards the U.S. Their aggressive posturing in the past was merely a struggle for survival and influence. He painted a picture of economic hardship, implying that expansion was a necessity, not a choice. He framed the ongoing conflicts as a costly and inefficient way to secure resources. He concluded by saying he'd heard the American president was a generous man, and his own government was tired of war, which was why they had sent him to negotiate a peaceful settlement. Before the president could reply, Caleb Thorne interjected coldly. If this was a negotiation between equals, on what grounds did Russia demand they surrender sovereign territory? Dmitry calmly reiterated that their actions were born of necessity. The U.S. had vast resources and global reach. Sharing a fraction would be a minor loss for them, but a major gain for Russia, preventing further conflict and saving lives on both sides. He then added a pointed remark, noting that he'd heard the U.S. was willing to offer massive concessions to China over the death of a single journalist. Surely, preventing thousands of deaths in exchange for just 5 bases was not an excessive request. The implication was clear. Russia and China were already in communication. Caleb's face hardened. President Sterling quickly raised a hand to silence him, turning to Dmitry. He acknowledged the validity of his points but stated that this was a matter of grave importance that couldn't be decided immediately. He suggested the Russian delegation rest for a few days while they deliberated. Dmitry smiled and readily agreed, and was then escorted to his quarters. The president then convened a private meeting with his key advisors. Once they were seated, President Sterling looked around the room, his expression troubled. He asked for their opinions. Caleb scoffed, asking if this was something that even required consideration. The president avoided his sharp gaze, turning to the others. After a brief hesitation, the gray-haired Secretary of the Treasury, Senator Mitchell, stepped forward. He respectfully stated that, in his view, the offer was worth considering. Caleb shot him a sideways glance. The president prompted him to elaborate. Senator Mitchell spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. He argued that the Russians' economic calculus was sound. Furthermore, maintaining those remote Arctic bases was a massive drain on the national budget each year. Ceding them would alleviate that financial burden. The territory was harsh and sparsely populated. Keeping them was a liability, while giving them up would not result in a significant strategic loss. Caleb's voice was like ice. He asked if Senator Mitchell was suggesting they just abandon the American personnel stationed at those bases because it was inconvenient. The senator sighed, explaining that it wasn't about abandonment. With America's global power and the existing military presence in the region, Russia wouldn't dare harm the personnel. He also pointed out that there were already informal economic ties between American contractors and Russian entities in the area, and relations were more cooperative than most people imagined. A fierce light flashed in Caleb's eyes. He asked if the countless soldiers who had died under his command to secure that region had done so just so the politicians could give it away for free. Other officials began whispering among themselves. One of them spoke up, sighing that while Secretary Thorne's efforts were commendable, times had changed. Peaceful relations and open communication were always preferable. Another added that, from a big-picture perspective, it was about preventing future sacrifices. Caleb swept his gaze over them, asking how they could be so sure the Russians would honor their promises. The official who had spoken shrank back and fell silent. Senator Mitchell shook his head, arguing that if they didn't at least try, they would never know. This was a rare opportunity for a diplomatic breakthrough with Russia. They had to show some measure of trust. Caleb laughed, a cold, emotionless sound. He remarked that the senator's foresight was truly beyond his comprehension. Senator Mitchell looked at Caleb and sighed helplessly. President Sterling chimed in, saying that since Russia had sent such a high-level envoy, it was a clear sign of their sincerity. To reject them outright might close the door to any future diplomacy. Caleb slowly raised his head, his gaze locking directly onto the president. A chilling smile touched his lips. He commented on the president's compassion, finding it ironic that it could lead to such a heartless betrayal of his country. The president asked what he meant by that. Caleb looked away, saying the president knew exactly what he meant. The president's face darkened, but he didn't get angry. He turned to the others, hesitantly beginning to say that it seemed the best course of action was. The Secretary of the Interior, Sir, stepped forward. He stated that he believed Secretary Thorne was right. The Russians could not be trusted. The president looked at him, surprised. The Secretary of Defense then spoke, his voice low and firm, his smile gone. He stated his absolute opposition and advised the president to reconsider. The president faltered. Senator Mitchell bowed deeply, imploring the president to consider the greater good. A few other voices echoed his sentiment. The president was caught in a difficult position. He saw Caleb's rigid posture, the unyielding glare he fixed on him, and his heart quailed. His gaze drifted involuntarily to the empty chair at his right hand, Julian's seat. Caleb followed his gaze, and his expression softened slightly. He said nothing. President Sterling waved his hand dismissively. He declared that this was not a decision to be made in a day. The Attorney General was already on his way back to Washington. It would be best to wait for his return before continuing the discussion. Several of the officials present were allied with Julian, so they had no objection. They all looked towards Caleb. Caleb finally retracted his gaze, casually agreeing that would be fine. In a quiet hallway, Senator Mitchell slowed his pace and stopped, leaning on a railing and staring out at the sky, his brow furrowed. A voice beside him asked if he was still worried about the Russian proposal. The senator turned to see the Secretary of Energy, a man named Hayes. After the previous secretary was indicted, Hayes, then his deputy, had been promoted. The senator nodded slowly. He admitted that while Secretary Thorne was, at his core, a military man with a limited understanding of grand strategy, there was some truth to what he had said. Hayes asked him to explain. The senator elaborated that the American citizens in those territories were, after all, still Americans. To simply hand them over to the Russians felt wrong. Hayes smiled, telling the senator that he was worrying over nothing. Caleb's objections were just a pretext for his own selfish interests, and his words shouldn't be taken too seriously. The senator looked at him in surprise. Since his appointment, Hayes had been a quiet operator, carefully maintaining a neutral stance between Caleb's and Julian's factions. It was unusual for him to be so candid. He asked Hayes what he meant. Hayes glanced around, then leaned in closer, lowering his voice. He revealed that Secretary Thorne was from Alaska. Ceding territory so close to his home state to the Russians was something he would never agree to, regardless of the larger strategic implications. The senator nodded in understanding. He remarked that he had wondered why Caleb had suddenly developed a concern for the common citizen. It seemed he had overestimated him. Hayes smiled, adding that, as the senator himself had noted, military men were often focused on short-term heroics and lacked long-term vision. Furthermore, if the U.S. and Russia became allies, would Secretary Thorne still command such influence? His words, Hayes concluded, were best ignored. Senator Mitchell pondered this. Hayes took a step back and bowed slightly. He assured the senator that most of them understood his difficult position. Regardless of the Attorney General's opinion upon his return, he would support the senator's decision. The senator was moved. He clapped Hayes on the shoulder, said no more, and walked with him out of the building. The dead of night. The rhythmic tick of a grandfather clock echoed through the dark room, the flickering candlelight casting shadows on the figure hunched over a desk. The warm light softened the sharp, elegant lines of his face as he studied a large, color-coded map, oblivious to the world around him. A quiet click broke the silence as a hidden door in the wall slid open. Marcus emerged, striding quickly to the desk and handing over a sealed envelope. He reported that it was a priority dispatch from the Southern Command. Caleb grunted in acknowledgement, his eyes still on the map as he made annotations. He told Marcus to just leave it. Marcus glanced at the clock on the wall. He pointed out that it was past midnight and asked if Caleb wasn't planning on getting any sleep. Caleb, now writing in a file, told him to go ahead and rest. He explained that he needed to finalize the security protocols for the upcoming Camp David summit in the morning and still had a lot of work to do. Marcus was confused. He asked why Caleb was handling the Camp David security. Wasn't that usually the responsibility of the Secret Service director? Caleb put down his pen. He explained that since the Russian delegation was still in town and had been invited to the summit, he couldn't afford any mistakes. Camp David wasn't the White House. He worried the director would stick to outdated protocols, not accounting for the Russians potentially trying something. Marcus nodded in understanding. The summit was a long-standing tradition, a relic of a time when diplomacy was intertwined with displays of power. Unfortunately, recent presidents had little interest in such things. The current president, Sterling, had turned the event into little more than a glorified corporate retreat for politicians and their families. Caleb remarked that the Russians, on the other hand, trained their children to be soldiers from birth. The contrast with America's current state was pathetic. He had initially worried they'd be mocked by the young Russian envoy, but then he recalled what President Sterling had said. Caleb paused, then mimicked the president's smooth, optimistic tone. This is a wonderful opportunity for them to witness the vibrant elegance of our democracy. He looked up at Marcus, his eyes glinting with dark humor. He asked if Marcus thought Sterling could hear the water sloshing around in his own head when he said things like that. Marcus was speechless. After a moment, he managed a dry request for his boss not to imitate the president. Caleb just smiled, telling him to go get some sleep. Marcus agreed, but as he turned to leave, Caleb called out to him. When Marcus turned back, Caleb hesitated, a rare look of uncertainty on his face. He frowned, his gaze dropping back to the map. Finally, he just said it was nothing. The sight was so unusual that Marcus stared at him for a long moment before speaking again. He mentioned that there was one other piece of news regarding Julian Vance. Caleb didn't look up, but his interest was piqued. He asked what it was. Marcus reported that Julian had brought a man back with him from Louisiana. The pen in Caleb's hand stopped, leaving a small blot of ink on the paper. He slowly raised his eyes, his expression unreadable, and told him to continue. That was all, Marcus said. Caleb stared at Marcus. Marcus stared back, his face a perfect mask. The silence stretched, thick and tense. Finally, Caleb broke into a cold smile. He warned Marcus that if he picked up any more of Leo's annoying habits, he'd find himself on the receiving end of a beating as well. Marcus averted his gaze. He elaborated that the man was a young officer from Broussard's militia, about 18 or 19, named Logan. On Julian's orders, he had returned to D.C. with the official convoy. Logan? Caleb had never heard the name. He thought for a moment, then concluded that 18 was a malleable age. With the current lack of military talent in the administration, if Julian recommended this boy to the president, it was likely an attempt to dilute his own power over the armed forces. Marcus immediately grew tense, asking what they should do. Caleb shot him a dismissive look, a cold smile playing on his lips. He asked what there was to worry about. Just because Julian was training the boy didn't guarantee success. Did Marcus really think that just anyone could achieve what he had? Marcus relaxed, reassured. Despite his confident words, a flicker of irritation remained in Caleb's eyes. He waved a hand, telling Marcus to leave. A single candle burned on the desk, its flame dancing in the silent room. The next morning, the sky was a pale gray. The Secret Service director arrived at the White House for an early meeting, only to find the Secretary of Defense already waiting for him. Shocked, he hurried over, full of apologies. He took the detailed security map with trembling hands, listening as Caleb gave a brisk summary. He couldn't help but study Caleb's face, cautiously asking if there was some emergency, as it was unusual for the secretary to be at the White House so early on a day off. Caleb, his eyes on a file in his hand, replied that there was no emergency. He just hadn't slept. The director fell silent. He offered to escort the secretary out. Caleb glanced at him, handed him the file, and turned to leave. The director followed respectfully behind. The White House grounds were quiet in the early morning light. A few groundskeepers bowed as they passed. Caleb suddenly spoke, telling the director to review the plan now and ask any questions he had. The director quickly opened the file. As he read, he expressed surprise, asking why the south slope of the mountain at Camp David was left undefended. That area was a steep cliff face leading down to a river that was always swollen and impassable in the spring. It was a natural barrier that never required security. Caleb took the file back, continuing to walk. He explained that this year, due to a lack of rain and a colder spring, the river was running much slower. Without the river as a deterrent, anyone with basic climbing skills could ascend the south slope. And since the south slope was dangerously close to the presidential cabins, his voice trailed off and he stopped walking. The director, engrossed in the explanation, looked up in confusion. He saw the Secretary of Defense staring off into the distance, his eyes dark and unreadable, but a slow, distinct smile was spreading across his face. Finally, something to look forward to. The words were a low murmur, lost in the morning breeze. The director followed his gaze. In the distance, beneath a trellis of climbing roses, a solitary figure was walking. Caleb told him to figure it out himself, thrusting the file back at the director without a second glance. He then started walking, his steps measured on the stone path, crushing the fallen petals under his feet. The morning dew glistened on the deep red petals, their sweet fragrance perfuming the air. Julian Vance paused amidst the vibrant spring colors, turning at the sound of his name. He looked up and smiled. He greeted Secretary Thorne, remarking that it had been a while. Caleb stopped in front of him, drawing out his words with a lazy smile. He acknowledged that it had been a while, and asked if the Attorney General had missed him while he was in Louisiana. Julian met his gaze with a serene smile, asking what Secretary Thorne thought. Caleb replied that he thought he had. He spread his arms wide, his eyes crinkling in a smile, and suggested they should have a hug to celebrate. He actually moved to embrace him. Julian, momentarily taken aback, glanced at the bewildered Secret Service director in the distance and quickly took a step back, raising a hand to block him. He reminded Caleb, with a hint of exasperation, that they were at the White House. Caleb nonchalantly dropped his arms and glanced over his shoulder. The director flinched as if startled, gave a distant, respectful nod, and then hurried away, his head down. Caleb slowly turned his attention back to Julian, asking if he had just returned. Julian confirmed that he had, having just finished briefing the president. He fell into step beside Caleb as they walked. Caleb asked how things were in Louisiana. Julian replied that things were stable for now, but he suspected, as Caleb probably did, that the situation was not as simple as it seemed. He added that for now, all they could do was wait and see, and that he would urge the president to implement the new federal oversight measures as soon as possible. Caleb interrupted, asking if Julian wasn't going to say he missed him, just once. Julian opened his mouth to reply, then paused, realizing what Caleb had actually said. He turned his head and met Caleb's smiling, expectant eyes. A reluctant smile touched his own lips, and he looked away without answering. He changed the subject, asking why the secretary was at the White House so early on a day off. Caleb just arched an eyebrow, saying it was nothing important. A voice suddenly called out from behind them, accompanied by the sound of running footsteps. They both turned to see a young man hurrying to catch up. He wiped sweat from his brow, breathing heavily. He told Julian that he walked so fast, he hadn't had a chance to thank him properly. Julian smiled placidly, telling the young man that he had already thanked him many times on the trip back. Besides, recommending talented individuals was part of his job. The fact that the president was impressed was a testament to the young man's own abilities, so there was no need for such excessive thanks. The young man, Logan, insisted that wasn't true. Without Julian, he would never have even made it to Washington. He was determined to thank him properly and offered to buy him dinner. Julian politely declined, smiling. He pointed out that they would be colleagues now, and there would be plenty of opportunities to see each other at official functions. There was no need for such formality. Logan started to protest again, but Caleb cut him off, asking Julian if this was the person he had brought back. The young man looked at Caleb with a puzzled expression. Julian motioned for him to be quiet and then explained to Caleb that this was Logan, who would be assigned to the Department of Defense. He added that Logan was still young and unfamiliar with Washington protocols, and asked for Caleb's future understanding. Caleb let out a soft "oh," a slow smile spreading across his face. He remarked that the Attorney General was known for his adherence to protocol, and he was curious to know what qualities in someone who didn't understand the rules had caught his eye. Julian calmly replied that rules could be taught, but a sincere and courageous heart could not. He then noticed Logan staring intently at them and asked if he had something to say. Logan nodded eagerly. He asked if, since it was a holiday, he wouldn't be able to meet any other high-ranking officials. Julian confirmed this was likely the case. Logan then pressed, asking where he might be able to find General Thorne. Before Julian could answer, Caleb spoke up, his expression neutral as he looked at the boy. He asked why he was looking for him. His tone was strangely flat, and Logan felt a surge of indignation. He retorted that he just wanted to see him. Was there anything wrong with that? Caleb asked what there was to see. Logan's voice rose with passion. He was the general who had driven back the Russians. He had reclaimed territories that had been occupied for 5 long years. Wasn't that something worth seeing? He finished with a defiant glare, asking if Caleb thought he was better to look at. Caleb let out a sudden, sharp laugh. His gaze drifted to the crushed petals on the ground. He spoke in a low, cutting voice about a military that had allowed the country to be humiliated for 5 years without a fight, filled with incompetent and arrogant officers. He had wasted a year of his life cleaning up their mess just to reclaim what was lost. He couldn't understand what was so glorious about that, or why people kept bringing it up. Logan was incensed. He shot back that it was easy to talk, and if Caleb was so great, why didn't he? Julian interrupted him. Logan, he said softly, this is Secretary Thorne. The words caught in Logan's throat. His face flushed a deep red as he stared at Caleb, unable to process the information. What? Him? How? Really? Caleb gave him a sidelong glance. Julian met the boy's incredulous gaze and gave a small, confirmatory nod. Logan whipped his head around, refusing to look at Caleb. He stared at Julian, sputtering for a moment before finally managing to get out a single, disbelieving question. General Thorne? He then muttered, his voice full of disappointment. But he can't look like that. Julian asked him what he meant. Logan's brow furrowed in a deep knot. He mumbled that a great general shouldn't look like that. So delicate, like a girl. Caleb, hearing this, let out a very soft laugh. He turned his head to look at the boy, asking what he thought a general should look like. 9 feet tall, built like a tank? Logan nodded enthusiastically. Caleb continued, asking if he should also have fists of steel and be able to lift a car. Logan nodded again, even more vigorously. Caleb stared at the earnest, round-faced young man for a long moment, then turned away, his expression complex. He couldn't be bothered to say another word. Julian, who had been watching this exchange with quiet amusement, lowered his gaze to hide a smile. Caleb was different from ordinary men. He had no need for a Herculean physique or an intimidating presence. 1,000 bottles of wine and 10,000 books couldn't wash away the fierce pride that was etched into his very being. This was exactly right. A red sports car tore through the streets of Georgetown, screeching to a halt in front of the stately home of Senator Reed, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. A young woman in a stylish red dress vaulted out, tossing the keys to a waiting valet. She strode into the house, calling out for her father. Senator Reed hurried out to meet her. He looked his daughter up and down, and seeing that she was unharmed, his tense expression relaxed. He asked his daughter, Clara, if she had any intention of ever coming home from her globetrotting adventures. Clara replied that she was home now, wasn't she? The senator countered that if he hadn't sent for her, she would still be off somewhere. Clara deftly changed the subject, linking her arm through his. She told him she had just gotten back from climbing mountains in Patagonia and asked if he'd ever seen such a place. It was absolutely. Her father cut her off, telling her to save it. He said she knew perfectly well why he had called her back. Clara shook her head, feigning ignorance. The senator was not amused. He told her again, his voice firm, that he had called her back to find a suitable husband and get her settled down. When Clara started to protest, he pulled his arm away, his face stern. He told her he had allowed her to play the part of the wandering adventurer, but marriage was not a game. She wasn't getting any younger, and there would be no more negotiating. Clara pouted in silence. The senator, seeing her expression, hardened his tone. The Camp David summit was in a few days. All the most important and influential people would be there. She was to accompany him, take a good look at the eligible young men, and pick one she liked. When they returned, he would arrange the introductions. Clara covered her face with her hands and sighed theatrically, saying that she understood. According to tradition, all officials and dignitaries attending the summit were to first accompany the president to a formal reception at the White House. The next day, they would depart for the retreat. Though the nature of the summit had changed over the years, the formalities remained. After the reception, President Sterling, eager to get back to his unfinished landscape painting, promptly departed. The other attendees, having delegated their duties for the next few days, were in no rush. The White House gardens were in full bloom, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. They lingered, chatting in small groups as they slowly made their way out. Julian Vance hung back, waiting for the presidential motorcade to be properly organized before leaving. He had only taken a few steps when someone approached him. It was Logan, the young officer, looking uncharacteristically serious in his dress uniform, though his excited expression betrayed his youthfulness. Julian hadn't noticed him in the security detail earlier. He gave the young man a warm, polite nod and asked if he was settling in well at the Pentagon. Logan answered honestly that he was not. When Julian asked why, Logan explained that since the Louisiana case had been closed and the official findings published, everyone now knew that Governor Broussard was a traitor. He wasn't blaming Julian, but he admitted he wasn't smart enough to understand the political intricacies. He had joined the military because he grew up hearing stories of General Thorne's battles against the Russians and wanted to serve his country. Broussard had never given him any real responsibility, and he had no strong feelings about him before learning of his treason. So, Coming to Washington with Julian had seemed like the right thing to do. But now, he confessed with some frustration, people were always asking him about Broussard. When he said he didn't know anything, they assumed he was hiding something. He had even overheard them whispering that he was one of Broussard's lingering loyalists, and that by bringing him to D.C., Julian had led a wolf into the sheepfold. Some even suggested that Julian himself had ulterior motives. He trailed off, his head bowed. Julian ignored the final comment, smiling serenely. He told Logan that if he had always been clear about his own goals, he shouldn't let the gossip of others hinder him now. Logan protested that even the regular security guards didn't trust him. Julian asked him a direct question. Was the goal he wanted to achieve wrong? Logan's answer was immediate and firm. Of course not. Defending his country could never be wrong. Julian then asked if the suspicion of others would make him waver. Logan thought for a moment and then shook his head. If it would, he wouldn't have come to D.C. in the first place. Julian smiled, his gaze distant. He told Logan that if that was the case, he had no reason to be troubled by their idle talk. Logan was taken aback, but after a moment he understood. He nodded at Julian, his eyes filled with a new determination. Then he hesitated, asking if he could ask one more question. When Julian encouraged him to speak freely, he asked, his voice low, if Julian and General Thorne had a very bad relationship. Julian was surprised, asking what made him say that. Logan hesitated, then explained that when people gossiped, they all seemed to believe that Julian had brought him to Washington to use him as a pawn against General Thorne, perhaps even to one day replace him. But he didn't understand why. General Thorne was a hero who had done so much for the country. Why would anyone want to work against him? Julian was silent. He turned his head slightly, his gaze falling on a figure standing alone under a willow tree. Caleb Thorne was idly toying with a green branch, his expression distant. The setting sun caught in his long eyelashes, casting a soft, golden light on his face. Why would anyone want to work against him? Because you have never seen Caleb Thorne in a moment of cold, ruthless decision-making. Because you have never seen the chilling smile on his face as he lays a perfect trap. You have not seen him effortlessly maneuver the President of the United States into surrendering military power. You have not witnessed how, in just a few short years, he climbed to the apex of power. Only bones and blood can build such a throne. On his trip to Louisiana, Julian had intended to test Caleb, to confirm his suspicions. But Caleb, as if sensing his intent, had made no move, keeping his ambitions carefully hidden. That night in the bar, Caleb had spoken of expanding the nation's influence, of bringing the world to heel. Julian knew he was sincere, but he also knew it was not that simple. But as long as Caleb remained passive, Julian could not guess his next move. He was at a loss. Why would anyone want to work against him? Because Julian thought, I can never, ever figure out what he is thinking. And that helplessness, that inability to know what to do, extended to how he should treat the man himself. Both professionally and personally. Logan, seeing Julian lost in thought, realized he had misspoken and quickly apologized. Julian shook himself out of his reverie and smiled placidly, allowing Logan to change the subject to something more mundane. Caleb's gaze returned from the distance. He crushed the willow leaf in his hand, feeling an inexplicable irritation at the sight of the two of them talking for so long. The green juice stained his pale fingers. As he stood there, he heard footsteps approaching from behind. He turned slowly, about to speak, but saw it was the Russian envoy, Dmitry Volkov, and his aide. Their eyes met for a fleeting second. The aide looked away in fear. Caleb turned his back to them, his expression indifferent. Dmitry's voice followed, speaking in Russian to his aide. He asked the man, Yulii, why he was so afraid of Thorne. The aide replied that the prince had never been on a battlefield, so he couldn't understand. It was like someone who had never seen a ghost could not know the terror of a ghost. Dmitry scoffed. A ghost? Him? He told Yuli that he was a strong Russian man, while that American looked as soft as a woman. He asked if Yuli wasn't ashamed to speak that way. Caleb had learned Russian during his time in the European theater. He couldn't speak it fluently, but he understood it perfectly. Since Dmitri assumed he didn't understand, he made no effort to hide his contempt. Caleb, in turn, feigned ignorance, not bothering to engage. Yuli, however, tugged at Dmitri's sleeve him to be careful. The Americans, he said, were more formidable than he thought. Dmitri retorted that he knew the Americans were clever. They lived in their cramped offices and their minds became just as twisted. They excelled at conspiracy and deceit. If not for that, with the strength of Russian men, this country would have been their territory long ago. Yuli sighed, muttering that the prince was still young and would one day learn that the stories told back home were not always true. Dmitri pulled his sleeve away, demanding to know what he meant. He asked if the stories of his eldest brother's victories were true. He asked if the great victories 13 years ago were true. Yuli confirmed that they were. Dmitri then asked why he was so afraid. So what if the Americans had one decent general now? 13 years ago, when Russia invaded, countless American commanders had abandoned their posts and fled. There was almost no resistance. The most pathetic of all was in Alaska. A woman had tried to lead a resistance. Her body was left hanging in the town square until it was mummified by the wind, and still, none of the remaining soldiers had the courage to fight back. During the 10-day occupation, not a single person had dared to resist. They were weak and pathetic. He sneered, saying that the Americans were all the same. Caleb snapped a branch off the willow tree. Yuli, seeing the motion, was terrified. He glanced at Caleb's unmoving back, then grabbed Dmitri's arm, disregarding protocol, and hastily pulled him down a different path, their figures disappearing into the trees. The sharp edges of the broken branch dug into Caleb's palm. He slowly uncurled his fingers. The sticky sap felt like thick blood. He looked up at the sky. The setting sun was a bloody smear across the horizon, stretching towards a future he couldn't see. Don't look back. The smoke of memory had burned for 13 years, a constant fire. A hail of bullets, the collapse of a barricade, a young man leaning against a ruined wall, watching hell unfold. Don't retreat. The fires of war consumed everything. The screams echoed across 1,000 miles of what was once a prosperous land. Russian tanks rolled over the bodies of children, leaving dark, bloody stains on the pavement. Caleb, don't look back. Don't retreat. You have to get out of here. You have to escape. Everyone else can be afraid. Anyone can retreat. Anyone can give up. Anyone can wait to die. But not you. Anna. The woman in the red jacket holding a rifle faltered. What is it? She asked, her voice raw. You look really scary right now. She froze, and then tears streamed from her bloodshot eyes. She covered her face, a choked, laughing sob escaping her lips. You little bastard. He couldn't stop himself from taking one last look back. Through the dense trees, he saw the familiar town, soaked in a crimson that seemed to seep into the very sky, staining it red. To raise a weapon in defiance was to end up a corpse on public display. Caleb closed his eyes, a very soft, very low laugh escaping him. A sharp, metallic sound cut through the air. The officials still lingering on the lawn looked around in shock. The sound had come from the grove of trees, but they could see no one. Before anyone could speak, another figure shot past them and into the woods, moving too fast to be identified. Only Logan stood frozen, wondering what the normally composed Attorney General could have seen to make him dash off without a word. Among the dense green leaves, a flash of dark blue fabric. Julian Vance caught it, his eyes focused. He pushed himself faster, and just as the figure moved again, he lunged, his hand clamping down on Caleb Thorne's shoulder. He used the momentary pause to pull Caleb into a tight embrace, his arm locking across his chest, struggling to restrain him. Let go. Calm down. Julian was still catching his breath, holding him tightly from behind. But Caleb was beyond hearing. He thrashed wildly. Pinned as he was, he couldn't use his full strength. So the combat knife in his hand suddenly changed direction, and he swung it backwards. Julian didn't flinch. He took the blow. The blade sliced across the side of his neck, a cold line of pain followed by a warm trickle of blood that snaked down his shoulder, staining the white collar of his shirt a brilliant red. An involuntary tremor ran through Julian. He gritted his teeth, his grip only tightening, locking Caleb in place. He raised his other hand and covered Caleb's eyes. His touch was firm, almost harsh, but his voice was soft. "Calm down. They are diplomatic envoys. You can't kill them, not now." Caleb hadn't expected him not to dodge. His struggles faltered. The moment Julian's palm covered his eyes, the world went blank, and the knife felt impossibly heavy in his hand. "Don't be impulsive. Just calm down. Think. The people you wanted revenge on, you killed them all on the battlefield. The territory you lost, you took it all back. It's over. It's all right. The people who hurt you are dead. You killed them. It's all in the past." He repeated the words over and over until he felt the man in his arms finally stop fighting. But a fine tremor still ran through Caleb's body, as if he was holding something back with immense effort. He felt the light brush of eyelashes against his palm. After a long silence, Caleb spoke. "Hey," he said, his voice raw and hoarse. In that same tone of voice, "Say a few more words to me. What do you want to hear?" Julian asked. Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then, very softly, he said, "Tell me you're here. Tell me you're still alive." Julian was taken aback for a second. He then turned his head, his lips close to Caleb's ear, and spoke slowly and clearly. "I am still alive. I am here." He paused, then continued in the gentlest voice he could manage. "I am with you." The words fell into his ear, each one warm and soothing. The embrace was warm, the familiar scent of that calming oil mixed with the faint, metallic smell of blood. Everything was a tangible, undeniable confirmation of this person's existence. Caleb gradually calmed down. After a moment of shared, audible breaths, he suddenly chuckled. "Is that all the strength you have?" Before Julian could react, Caleb spun around and pulled him into a fierce embrace. He had dropped the knife. The steel blade clattered to the ground. He held Julian tightly, with a force that seemed intended to fuse their bodies together, a gesture of absolute, possessive ownership. He buried his face in the crook of Julian's neck. The scent of blood drew him closer, and without, his lips were on the wound. Julian went completely rigid. The warm, wet sensation continued, oblivious, as Caleb's mouth moved against his skin, his tongue tracing the line of the cut, licking away the blood. His breath ghosted over Julian's neck, sending a strange, tingling sensation down his spine. Caleb's arms tightened, pulling at the collar of Julian's shirt, his lips following the trail of blood from his neck to his shoulder, then to his collarbone, seeking the end of the wound. A light breeze rustled through the trees. The cool air on his exposed shoulder finally broke through Julian's stupor. "Caleb!" He pulled Caleb's hands away and took a step back, pulling his torn collar together, his eyes downcast to hide the panic in them. Caleb stood where he was, his eyes slowly clearing. He blinked, as if waking from a long dream, momentarily disoriented. Julian. Julian had already composed himself. Aside from the bloodstain, he looked perfectly normal. When he looked up, even his smile was the same as always, calm and distant. He told Caleb it was good that he had calmed down. He started to apologize, but Julian cut him off, saying it wasn't a serious injury and Caleb shouldn't blame himself. Caleb tried again, saying that wasn't what he meant, he had just... Julian interrupted him again, saying there were people waiting and they should get back. Caleb fell silent, just watching him. Julian looked away, then after a moment he gave a small, soft laugh. "Don't worry about it." Caleb still didn't know what he wanted to say. In that moment of hesitation, Julian glanced back at him, his smile as fleeting and ethereal as smoke, and then turned and walked away. The blood stain on Julian's collar was too conspicuous to hide. When he and Caleb emerged from the woods, one after the other, a ripple of whispers went through the remaining officials. Julian walked calmly back to Logan, who was waiting anxiously, and apologized for his abrupt departure. Logan, still dazed, shook his head. He asked how Julian had gotten hurt, if the sound they heard was General Thorne's knife, and what had happened between them. Julian explained calmly that there had been an accident. Secretary Thorne had drawn his knife to stop a falling tree branch, and in the confusion, he had been scratched. It was nothing. Logan believed him without question. He stared at Julian's neck, then asked with concern if he was sure he was okay, because his face seemed a little flushed. Julian paused, touching his own cheek with the back of his hand. He kept his voice steady as he asked if it was. Logan nodded, pointing out that his ears seemed a little red too. Julian dropped his hand. He met Logan's sincere, worried gaze and sighed. He told the young man to forget what he had said earlier. He didn't need to rush to prove himself with great deeds. It would be better if he spent some time reading. Logan was baffled. He asked what good reading would do. He was a soldier, not a scholar. Julian replied that he should read more to learn the ways of the world. News of this nature travels fast. By the time Caleb returned to his residence, Leo and Marcus were waiting for him, flanking the door like sentinels. Leo started in with a sarcastic tone, remarking on Caleb's impressive knife skills. He'd heard that if the angle had been just a little different, his cousin would be dead. He had pointedly dropped the formal cousin-in-law to the more intimate cousin to make his allegiance clear. Marcus, his usually stoic face showing a flicker of excitement, asked if Caleb had decided to stop playing games and just make his move. Caleb ignored them both and walked into his room. Marcus followed, asking why he looked so pale. Leo's tone turned gleeful as he asked if Caleb had finally been struck by lightning. Caleb slammed the door in their faces. He sat down at his desk and poured himself a glass of water. After he had drained it, a complex expression crossed his face. He pressed his fingers to his temples, muttering to himself in disbelief. How in the world did I end up licking Julian Vance? It was late spring. Most of the blossoms in Washington had faded, but the mountains of the Catoctin Range seemed to hold onto the season. A grove of peach trees was in full, glorious bloom, a sea of pink against the green hills. After a long day of travel, everyone was exhausted upon arriving at Camp David. They dispersed to their assigned cabins, saving the appreciation of the scenery for the next day's formal events. Julian politely thanked several colleagues for their concern and was about to leave when his eyes were drawn to the side. Caleb Thorne was standing there alone, leaning against a peach tree with his arms crossed, watching him with a thoughtful expression. Julian hesitated for a moment, then walked over. He offered a faint smile, asking if Secretary Thorne was not going to rest after the long journey, and what he was thinking about so intently. Caleb's gaze was quiet as he watched Julian approach. When he was standing in front of him, Caleb's lips curved into a smile. "I was thinking about you." Julian paused, then gave a dismissive smile. He reminded Caleb that with the Russian delegation present, the next day would surely be demanding for him, and he should get some rest. Caleb pushed himself off the tree, saying he was in no mood to rest. There was something he hadn't figured out yet, and his mind wouldn't be still. Julian asked what could be so important. Caleb replied that it was very important. He looked at Julian, his voice slow and deliberate, and asked if he wanted to know what it was. Julian said he was willing to listen. Caleb's smile widened. And what if he didn't tell him? He suggested that Julian take a walk with him. Perhaps if his mood improved, he might feel like talking, and then he might be able to rest. Julian let out a helpless sigh, but a small smile played on his lips. "All right." Clara Reed swept aside the curtain of her limousine and jumped out. The moment her feet touched the ground, she clutched her chest dramatically. complaining that she had told her father to let her ride her motorcycle. Being cooped up in the car for so long was suffocating. Her assistant came to help her, smiling. She remarked that riding in a car was much more relaxing than riding a motorcycle, and that her lady would get used to it. Clara retorted that she had no desire to get used to it. She asked where her father was. Her assistant explained that the senator had run into an old friend and would be back shortly. He had specifically instructed them to wait there so that his daughter could. The assistant paused, smiling slyly. Take a good look around. Take a good look around. Clara rolled her eyes and scanned the area. She muttered about what there was to see. All the handsome young men looked wilted after the long drive. Her voice trailed off. In the distance, under a peach tree, a man stood tall and elegant. The corners of his lips were turned up in a smile as he spoke to someone, his eyes sparkling with a deep, mesmerizing light. The hem of Clara's red dress fluttered in the breeze. The wind, it seemed, had risen just to brush past that man's brow, as if to borrow a fraction of his unparalleled charm for the peach blossoms. Clara leaned on her assistant's shoulder, her eyes still fixed on the scene. He's beautiful, she breathed. What's beautiful? Senator Reed asked, coming up behind them. Dad. Clara spun around. I've made my choice. So quickly. Her father asked. Who is it? Over there. Clara pointed. I want him. The senator looked in the direction she was pointing. He saw Julian Vance turning around and a pleased expression crossed his face. The one in the white shirt? I knew my daughter had good taste. No. Clara interrupted. The one next to him in the dark blue. The senator's face fell. Absolutely not. Dad, Clara pleaded as she followed her father through their cabin. I said no, and that's final. Nothing you say will change my mind, the senator declared, his tone unyielding. Clara demanded to know why not. He had told her she could choose for herself. The senator, exasperated, stopped and turned to face her. He asked what was wrong with her. Of all the talented and respectable young men available, she had to pick Secretary Thorne. He demanded to know what she saw in him. Clara shrank back a little, then answered honestly. He's beautiful. His looks alone have bewitched you? Her father fumed. Is Attorney General Vance not also handsome? Dad, Clara said, staring at him in shock. The senator realized his slip of the tongue. He glanced around, and seeing no one else, he continued. Clara, explain yourself. What are you thinking? Clara studied her father's expression, then said with great seriousness, the Attorney General is also attractive. But they are different. He is beautiful, yes, but he's the kind you can only look at, not touch. You want to touch Secretary Thorne? The senator's temper flared again. I have indulged your whims since you were a child. But how have you become so shameless? That's not what I meant, Clara said, closing her mouth with a frustrated sigh. She bowed her head and resigned herself to his lecture. After his anger had subsided, the senator looked at his daughter's dejected face and softened his tone. Fine. If you have no interest in the Attorney General, I will help you find someone else. Take your time. He paused. But you are to forget about Secretary Thorne. It's not just about his character. Everyone in Washington knows he is shamelessly pursuing the Attorney General. You are not to get involved in that mess. Clara, her head still bowed, rolled her eyes. She couldn't believe her father would resort to such a ridiculous lie. But Clara was not a sheltered debutante. She had traveled the world. If her father wouldn't approve a formal match, she decided she would try for a more direct approach. The night was dark and quiet. Clara sat at her desk, waiting. When her assistant returned with a lantern, she asked eagerly for news. Her assistant hesitated, then asked if she was truly set on this course of action. Clara cut her off, saying of course she was. Otherwise, why would she have sent her? She demanded to know what had happened. The assistant reported that she had been unable to see Secretary Thorne. He was not in his cabin. Clara was surprised. Where else would he be in the middle of the night? The assistant replied dutifully that a guard had seen the secretary take a bottle of whiskey and go up to the mountain pavilion alone. Drinking alone at night. How romantic. Clara nodded in appreciation. Then it dawned on her. Everyone else was exhausted and had gone to bed. No one would be at the pavilion. She clapped her assistant on the back, her voice filled with excitement. This is a gift from the heavens. Her assistant, wincing in pain, asked in alarm if her lady was planning on going there. Of course. Clara stood up, smoothing her dress. A beautiful night, a scenic location. It's the perfect setting for a confession of love. Her assistant was speechless. She finally managed to say that it would be cold on the mountain at night, and she should fetch a cloak. Clara waved her off. A damsel in distress was more likely to win a man's heart. The cold would be to her advantage. But, my lady, a stern voice interrupted. What are you doing going to the mountain pavilion? Clara froze. She turned stiffly, forcing a smile. That, Senator Reed's brow was furrowed. He demanded to know who she was going to see. Before the assistant could answer, Clara blurted out, Attorney General Vance. The senator was skeptical. Clara nodded, turning her head away as if shy, and shot her assistant a meaningful look. Yes, the Attorney General. The senator asked why she would want to see him. Clara took a deep breath. She reminded her father that he had always been fond of the Attorney General. After he had left, she had thought about it, and she wasn't entirely indifferent to him. She had sent a message to arrange a meeting to see if he was as wonderful as her father claimed. The senator replied that there was no doubt about the Attorney General's character. Clara quickly agreed, sneaking a glance at her father's expression. That's why I wanted to see him. Her father nodded. It's good for you to get to know him. Clara smiled obediently, then asked what he had come for. The senator said it was nothing, he had just come to discuss this very matter. Since she had already made up her mind, he was relieved. He told her to go ahead, and that he was going to play a few rounds of chess with some old friends. He was about to leave when he turned back. But Clara looked at him nervously. What is it? You should still take a cloak. Clara felt a warmth in her chest and lowered her head, agreeing. Once her father was gone, the assistant, who had been holding her breath, finally spoke. My lady, are you still going to the pavilion? Of course, Clara said, looking up and tucking a stray hair behind her ear. I've come this far, I can't turn back now. She paused, her confidence wavering slightly. But I'll wait a little longer, just in case my father sees me. Meanwhile, Senator Reed, feeling a great weight lifted from his shoulders, strode into Senator Mitchell's cabin, announcing cheerfully that he was there for a late-night chess match. Senator Mitchell rose with a smile to greet him. Behind him, another figure stood up from the fireside, his voice calm and smooth. Senator Reed, you seem to be in high spirits. Is there good news? The senator froze. Attorney General. Julian Vance nodded. Please come in. The senator didn't move. He asked what Julian was doing there. Senator Mitchell explained that the Attorney General had come to discuss the Russian delegation and they had been chatting. He suggested that since the senator was in the mood for chess, he should play a game with the Attorney General. The senator mumbled an agreement, his eyes still fixed on Julian as Senator Mitchell went to get the chessboard. He couldn't help but ask, weren't you supposed to have a meeting tonight? Julian shook his head, smiling. I had no meeting scheduled. The senator fell silent, his expression shifting through a range of complex emotions. Julian asked him what was wrong. The senator sighed. He confessed, with some embarrassment, that his daughter had long admired the Attorney General. Now that she was here, she had taken it upon herself to invite him to the mountain pavilion for a private meeting. He had just caught her getting ready to go. Julian frowned slightly. But I received no such invitation. That's what I found strange as well, the senator said quickly. But then I realized, since you have been here with Senator Mitchell all this time, the messenger must have failed to deliver the message. The implication was clear. Julian sighed softly. I am grateful for your daughter's admiration, Senator, but I have no intention of marrying. I would not want to waste her time. It is my daughter who is infatuated, the senator said. I am at a loss. I imagine she is already at the pavilion, and she will not leave until she has seen you. It gets cold on the mountain at night. Even if you have no interest, perhaps you could go and see her, just to put her mind at ease. Julian considered this for a moment. He conceded that he understood the senator's concern for his daughter. In that case, I will take my leave. Excellent, excellent, the senator said, rising with Julian. Please go quickly. He stood at the door, watching Julian's figure disappear into the darkness. Behind him, Senator Mitchell returned with the chessboard, asking in surprise where the Attorney General had gone. The senator turned back into the room and clapped his friend on the shoulder. He said, with a profound sense of weariness, "You are lucky you have a son who is already married." Senator Mitchell looked at him, bewildered. The senator sighed a long, heavy sigh. This parenting thing is going to be the death of me. The mountain pavilion was, as its name suggested, a gazebo built on a high point of the mountain, offering a view of the scattered lights of the retreat below. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees. Julian walked up the stone steps. The scene in the pavilion came into view. There was no young lady waiting. There was only one person, slumped over the stone table, a figure he knew all too well. Julian walked closer, confused. Caleb? There was no answer. Caleb Thorne had his head pillowed on his arm, his face peaceful in a way Julian had rarely seen. He seemed to be in a deep sleep, unaware of Julian's approach. A half-empty bottle of whiskey sat beside him. The air was thick with the scent of alcohol. His dark hair was spread over his shoulders, catching the silvery moonlight. His lips, slightly parted, were moist and red. His pale cheek was pressed against the intricate embroidery on his dark blue sleeve. Julian's gaze softened. He watched him for a long, silent moment, then took off his own jacket and draped it over Caleb's shoulders. He bent down to pull the lapels snugly up to his chin. As he straightened, he paused, his hand hovering in the air. His eyes were full of a deep, unspoken emotion. He reached out, his fingers moving slowly, cautiously, towards Caleb's face. Just as he was about to touch him, he stopped. He lowered his gaze, a self-deprecating smile on his lips. As he started to pull his hand back, it was suddenly caught in a firm grip. Caleb pulled Julian's hand to his own cheek and slowly opened his eyes. They were deep and dark, reflecting the vastness of the night sky. He said nothing, just looked at Julian. Julian was startled for only a second. He didn't try to pull his hand away. He just looked down at Caleb with a gentle smile. "Secretary Thorne, do you not recognize me?" Caleb remained silent. He let go of Julian's hand, then reached up towards his face. Julian turned his head slightly to avoid the touch, but Caleb's hand continued, unerringly, to the jade pin holding his hair. With a twist of his wrist, he pulled it free. Julian's long, dark hair cascaded down his back like a silken waterfall. Their eyes met. Julian was confused. Caleb's gaze was intense, a storm brewing in their depths. He let the pin drop. It hit the stone floor with a sharp click. Caleb leaned in, cupped Julian's face in his hands, and kissed him. It was sudden, unexpected. The jacket slipped from Caleb's shoulders and fell to the floor. He traced the line of Julian's lips with his own. Then his tongue slipped past his teeth, carrying the sharp taste of whiskey, exploring, tasting, a deep, lingering kiss. Julian froze, his mind a complete blank. His eyes were wide, but all he could see was the blurry image of Caleb's face, too close to read his expression. He thought he heard Caleb chuckle, a low sound muffled by their kiss, followed by a gentle bite on his lip. A tingling sensation spread through him like wildfire. His heart hammered against his ribs. The shock finally broke through his daze. He grabbed Caleb's wrist. The sudden pain made Caleb loosen his grip, and Julian used the opportunity to pull away, taking several steps back. They stood apart, breathing heavily, their eyes averted. Julian's gaze fell on the shattered pieces of the jade pin on the floor. He took a deep breath to steady himself, then spoke, his voice strained. "Are you sober now?" Caleb looked down at the red mark on his wrist. His voice was flat as he replied, "I wasn't drunk." Julian managed a small smile, not pursuing the topic. He bid him good night and turned to leave without waiting for a reply. His steps hurried, not daring to look back. Caleb watched his figure disappear into the night. He picked up the bottle and took a long drink, the cold liquid spilling down his chin and soaking the front of his shirt. Even half a bottle of whiskey couldn't quell the fire in his veins. He touched his own lips, a slow smile spreading across his face. He whispered to the empty pavilion, "I'm done for." The words he had so often used to mock others had finally come back to him. When he no longer suppressed it, no longer deceived himself, the answer was so simple. He had fallen for him. Julian hurried down the stone steps, his mind replaying the scene in the pavilion, a chaotic mess of emotions. The cool mountain air did nothing to calm the heat that was spreading through his body. He had never felt so flustered, so out of control. That was why he hadn't dared to look at him again. He was so lost in thought that he didn't notice someone walking towards him until they spoke his name in surprise. Attorney General. Clara Reed stared at him, her expression uncertain. Julian looked at her, managing a hasty smile. "Excuse me." He brushed past her without breaking his stride. Clara stared after him, utterly bewildered. She couldn't understand why the composed and dignified Attorney General would be in such a state. But she didn't dwell on it. She took a deep breath and continued up to the pavilion. The man was there, just as her assistant had said, leaning against the stone table, lost in thought. He looked up at the sound of her footsteps, a frown on his face. "Who are you?" "My name is Clara Reed." "My father is Senator Reed," she said, giving a polite curtsy. "What do you want?" Caleb asked, his gaze returning to the white jacket on the floor. He picked it up and carefully brushed off the dust. "Nothing really," Clara said, gathering her courage. "I just saw you drinking alone up here, Secretary, and wondered if something was troubling you." "There was something," Caleb said, his voice soft as he held the jacket, inhaling the faint, calming scent that clung to it. "But it's not troubling me anymore." A slow smile spread across his face. "I was sitting here with my eyes closed, thinking, and when I opened them, the person I was thinking of was right here. Suddenly, everything became clear. My troubles have turned to joy." Clara's eyes darted around the pavilion. "The person you were thinking of, your lover?" "Of course. And would you mind telling me who it is?" she asked tentatively. Caleb slipped the jacket on. He chuckled, his fingers toying with the lapel. He slowly raised his eyes to meet hers, his smile dazzling. "When you were coming up here, didn't you see him?" Clara froze. She recognized the jacket. Her mind flashed back to her first glimpse of him, that breathtaking sight under the peach tree. She realized now that the smile that had so captivated her had been directed at the man in this very jacket. Her gaze fell on Caleb's slightly disheveled collar. Her father's words about their relationship suddenly made a shocking amount of sense. She thought of the scene she had just witnessed. Julian, flustered and disheveled, hurrying away, and here was Caleb wearing his jacket. The romantic pavilion, the moonlight, the whiskey, the shattered pin on the floor. She felt her face flush a deep red. Even after she had returned to her cabin, Clara couldn't shake the image from her mind. A strange mix of emotions churned within her. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She replayed the scene on the path. The Attorney General, his hair down, his face flushed in the moonlight. And at the pavilion, Secretary Thorne wearing his jacket, the rumpled clothes. It was clear what had happened. She sighed, a new understanding dawning on her. The Attorney General, he's not what he seems. But then she remembered Julian's haste to leave, and Caleb left alone in the pavilion. Even though he had left his jacket, it seemed a rather cold thing to do. Her assistant watched, concerned, as her lady's expression shifted from delight to sorrow. She was wondering if she should go and get the senator when Clara covered her face with her hands and wailed, "To be used and then cast aside. Secretary Thorne is so pitiful." The assistant was dumbfounded. Clara dropped her hands, her expression now one of grim determination. "Don't you think," she said to her assistant, "that they are actually perfect for each other?" "My lady, as a woman of the world," Clara declared, "I cannot stand by and watch this injustice. I have decided. Since I admire him, I must help him escape this toxic relationship and win the heart of his true love." The assistant just stared. The next day, no matter who had spent a sleepless night, everyone had to put their personal dramas aside and attend the official banquet. President Sterling had a flair for such things. The outdoor banquet was a masterpiece of elegance. Music, dancing, and a stream flowing through the center of the table, carrying cups of wine to the guests. The Secretary of Defense and the Attorney General were seated at opposite ends of the table, as per protocol. Caleb leaned on his hand, his eyes meeting Julian's across the distance. Julian simply gave him a faint, polite smile, then looked away and took a sip of his wine, his expression as serene as ever. There was no anger, no awkwardness. If Caleb didn't so clearly remember the way Julian had fled from him the night before, he would have thought it was all a dream. He wondered if Julian was simply choosing to not worry about it again. He scowled, plucking a cup of wine from the stream. Just as the song ended, a loud, theatrical sigh cut through the momentary silence. All eyes turned to the Russian delegation. President Sterling asked Dmitry Volkov if something was wrong with the hospitality. Dmitry stood and gave a polite bow. He assured the president that the hospitality was excellent. He just found the cultural differences between their two countries to be vast, and it had made him thoughtful. When the president asked him to elaborate, he explained that while the food and wine were exquisite, he found the endless music and dancing to be rather dull. He had been looking forward to the summit, hoping to see some American marksmanship, maybe even find a worthy opponent for a friendly competition. He was disappointed to find it was just another banquet. He looked around at the guests, remarking that they all seemed very civilized, not the sort who would be skilled with a bow and arrow. He supposed that in a peaceful country, such crude skills were unnecessary. He envied them. The words were complimentary, but the tone was pure sarcasm. A chill fell over the banquet. Caleb turned to him. "If you're looking for a competition, I'd be happy to oblige." Dmitry waved a hand, smiling. "Everyone knows of General Thorne's reputation on the battlefield. I am a skilled archer, but I am no soldier. Competing against you would be no fun. I would only lose. If you're afraid to compete, then what was the point of your speech?" Caleb asked coldly. "I am not afraid to admit that I cannot beat you," Dmitry said smoothly. "I was just remarking that, aside from General Thorne, there seems to be no one else here. It is rather boring." The administration's focus on diplomacy over military strength was well known. Dmitry's taunt, though provocative, hit a nerve. No one could refute it. Caleb was losing his patience. "Are you done, or the prince does have a point?" Julian Vance stood up, interrupting him. "Secretary Thorne holds a high office. It would be a waste of his time to engage in such trivial matters." He looked at Caleb, then turned his gaze back to Dmitry, a calm smile on his face. "What do you say to me?" He admitted that though he was a civilian official, he had an interest in archery. This would be a good opportunity to learn. Dmitry looked him up and down at his slender, scholarly build. He remarked that if they competed, people would say he was bullying him. Julian's smile sharpened. He confessed he was a little confused by the prince's words. He wouldn't compete against Secretary Thorne because he was too strong, and he wouldn't compete against him because he was too weak. Was he, Julian asked, only interested in a battle of words with no intention of actually competing? Dmitry's smile faded. Are you questioning my honor? Not at all, Julian said smoothly. As you said yourself, it is merely for entertainment. Why should we be concerned with winning or losing? But everyone knew it was more than that. The honor of their countries was at stake. President Sterling tried to intervene, but Dmitry insisted. Since the Attorney General had already agreed, it would be unseemly to back out now. The president looked at Julian with concern, but Julian just gave him a reassuring smile. He then asked Dmitry what he proposed they compete in. Dmitry said that to make it fair, they would just compete in archery, no horseback riding involved. Julian agreed. A servant brought him a longbow. Julian took it, a nostalgic look flashing in his eyes. He then turned and called out to Caleb. Secretary Thorne, I'm afraid I'll need you to show me how to use this. Caleb walked over to him. He glanced at Julian's grip on the bow and smirked. Attorney General, your form is impressively incorrect. Julian ignored the jibe, lowering his voice. When the prince takes his shot, make sure he doesn't try anything funny towards the president. Move your left hand up a little, Caleb said, adjusting the bowstring for him. Julian didn't move. He looked at Caleb. Secretary Thorne? Caleb looked up, meeting his gaze. A slow smile spread across his face. Kiss me, and I'll keep an eye on him for you. Julian just stared at him. Caleb lowered his lashes, his voice a lazy drawl. Attorney General, if you keep looking at me like that, you'll make me blush. Will I? Julian asked. Caleb sighed, as if greatly put upon. All right, since you're so eager, you can give me two. Julian couldn't help but laugh. A genuine, helpless sound. Caleb, fine. I get it, Caleb said, his eyes on the small smile lines around Julian's lips. He suddenly grabbed Julian's wrist and moved behind him, wrapping his arms around him. This is easier. Julian stiffened, about to pull away. Don't move, Caleb whispered, his lips brushing Julian's ear. He positioned Julian's hands on the bow. What are you afraid of? With all these people watching, do you really think I'd kiss you again? Julian was speechless. They were standing in a secluded spot, away from the main crowd. A small, selfish part of him gave in and he stopped struggling. Caleb rested his chin on Julian's shoulder, his breath warm against his cheek. He guided Julian's hands, then released him and stepped back. Julian glanced over his shoulder. Caleb was back in his original position. When their eyes met, Caleb slowly smiled, then raised his fingers to his lips and gave Julian a meaningful wink. Julian pretended not to see and turned his attention to the president. The target had been set up. Dmitry Volkov stepped forward, drew his bow and fired. The arrow flew straight and true, hitting the bullseye. The Russian delegation cheered. President Sterling looked at Julian with growing anxiety, but Julian just gave him a reassuring nod and walked to the firing line. He drew the bow, his shoulders broadening, his eyes sharp and focused in a way rarely seen. He released the arrow. It flew with a whistling sound, striking the first arrow and embedding itself in the bullseye next to it, just slightly off-center. Julian turned and handed the bow to a servant. The Russian delegation was already celebrating. The American officials were silent. But Caleb, his eyes still on the target, let out a low chuckle. There was a sudden cracking sound. The first arrow, struck by the second, split in two and fell to the ground. Dmitry's face turned livid. Julian paused beside him, a faint smile on his lips. That was easier than I expected. Dmitry whipped his head around, but Julian was already walking back to his seat. He stared at the Attorney General's slender back, remembering how Caleb had whispered in his ear, and his hands clenched into fists. Family members were not allowed at the official banquet, so Clara Reed waited outside for it to end. She had spent the previous night studying romance novels and had come to the conclusion that the best she could do was create opportunities for the two men to be alone. She had invited Julian to a secluded peach grove behind the main lodge, and to her surprise, Julian, perhaps feeling guilty about his behavior the night before, had agreed. Caleb was another matter. She hadn't seen him all morning, which was why she was waiting now. She heard the sounds of the banquet ending. As the crowd dispersed, she spotted Caleb. She dodged her father and hurried over. "Secretary Thorne, a moment of your time." Caleb paused, turning to her. "You again?" "It's me," Clara said with a smile. "I was wondering if you were free." "I'm not," Caleb said flatly. "I just wanted to invite you to the peach grove for a moment. It won't take long." "I'm not going." "But why be so quick to refuse? Is there anything else?" Caleb asked, his tone dismissive. "No," Clara said, dejected. As Caleb started to walk away, she blurted out, "Attorney General Vance is there." Caleb stopped and turned back, a slow, knowing smile on his face. "Oh? I wouldn't lie to you, Secretary," Clara said earnestly. Caleb turned fully to face her. "What are you playing at?" "Nothing," Clara said, shaking her head. She took a deep breath. "I just hope I can be of some help to you." Caleb studied her for a moment, then chuckled. "You remind me of someone." "Who?" Clara asked, surprised. Caleb looked away, a playful glint in his eye. "Perhaps it's just that all women who practice martial arts and wear red are a little crazy." Before Clara could react, he had turned and walked away. Julian heard footsteps and looked up. Through the vibrant peach blossoms, the man approached, a smile on his face. Julian expressed his surprise at the coincidence of them both being there. Caleb stopped in front of him, his smile widening. "It's no coincidence. I believe you're waiting for me." Julian was confused. He said that it was Senator Reed's daughter who had invited him. "That's right," Caleb said. "And she's the one who sent me to meet you." Julian frowned. "What do you mean?" "Simple," Caleb said, his eyes twinkling. "Even a stranger has been moved by my devotion. Isn't it time for you to finally say yes?" "You're joking, Secretary," Julian said with a laugh. "Believe what you want," Caleb said. He then added, "But on such a beautiful day, shouldn't you pay back your debt?" "What debt do I owe you?" "The archery match," Caleb said, stepping closer and tilting Julian's chin up with his fingers. "You've forgotten so quickly." His thumb traced the line of Julian's lips. "But if you're too shy, I can be the one to take the initiative." Julian pulled his hand away, laughing softly. It seems the secretary had too much to drink at the banquet. "My tolerance is excellent," Caleb said. "And I wasn't drunk last night either." Julian didn't reply, his gaze shifting to the blossoms on a nearby branch. "It's late in the season. This may be the last of the peach blossoms we see this year." Caleb's eyes never left his face. "I was awake the entire time last night." Julian's hand, hidden in his sleeve, clenched. But his expression remained calm. "I see. I was wondering why you were sleeping in the pavilion. I was worried you would catch a cold." "Speaking of which," Caleb drawled, "I'm not giving you your jacket back." Julian smiled. "That's fine. If you like it, you're welcome to keep it." Caleb stared at him, as if trying to read his mind. He then chuckled softly. "But I like you more. Will you let me keep you as well?" Julian was taken aback. He lowered his gaze, his voice soft. "Secretary, you're joking." Caleb tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. "Why won't you look at me?" A knot formed in Julian's chest. He slowly raised his eyes to meet Caleb's. The gaze that met him was deep and intense, like the night sea. Caleb leaned in closer. "And what if I'm not joking?" Their eyes locked. Julian was silent for a moment. Then he seemed to understand. "I have already spoken with Senator Mitchell about the Russian proposal. Since the president wants to wait for my opinion, I will consider it carefully. You don't need to worry." The smile vanished from Caleb's face. "When did I ever say this was about the Russians?" Julian smiled. "I've told you before, Secretary, you should stop beating around the bush. It's always better to be direct." "Julian," Caleb said, grabbing his hand. He looked into his eyes, his voice earnest. "I like you. Do you like me?" Julian froze. "I've been direct," Caleb said softly. "Will you answer me?" Julian came back to himself, trying to pull his hand away. "Caleb, this is..." Caleb's grip tightened. Will you trust me? Silence. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. The sky had turned a dark, menacing gray. Julian looked up at the clouds, then gently pulled his hand free. He sighed. It's the end of spring, it rains often. We should head back before we get caught in it. His hand was empty. The wind blew through his sleeve, carrying away the last of the warmth. Caleb curled his fingers into a fist, but his smile returned. I knew you'd react like that. You're hopeless. A block of stone. Julian chuckled. Your charms, secretary, are probably beyond anyone in this world. Not at all, Caleb said, his eyes sparkling. If you just pay back your debt, I can teach you how to be the only one who understands. Julian gave him a helpless, fond look. Stop fooling around. Let's go back before it starts raining. Caleb agreed. As Julian turned to leave, a sudden gust of wind whipped through the grove, carrying the sweet, damp scent of peach blossoms. The petals rained down around them. Caleb spoke, his voice a low rumble, almost lost in the wind. There's still time. Julian didn't hear him clearly. He turned back. What? Caleb's eyes shone. He smiled and walked over to stand beside him. Nothing. Outside the grove, Clara Reed hesitated. Curiosity finally won out, and she tiptoed in. The blossoms were at their end, a riot of desperate, beautiful color. She looked around, and through the trees, she saw a solitary figure. Her heart sank. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She hurried forward, pushing aside a branch. What happened? You didn't find, her voice died in her throat. She stared, dumbfounded, at a man sitting at an easel, a paintbrush in his hand. He looked up at her in surprise. On the canvas was a painting of the peach grove. Clara, realizing her mistake, turned to leave. Sorry, wrong person. Her brow surpasses the color of the orchids. Her red dress outshines the pomegranate flower. The man's voice was calm and commanding. Don't move. She froze. Huh? The man dipped his brush in ink and, with a few quick strokes, captured her likeness on the canvas. He then looked up at her with a kind smile. Don't be nervous. Just stand naturally. Okay, Clara said. She couldn't help but fuss with her hair. Well, make it a good one. The man smiled. Of course. He had a gentle, scholarly face. Clara watched him for a while, then asked, Hey, did you see anyone else here earlier? The man shook his head without looking up. Strange, Clara mumbled. She started chatting to pass the time. Is this your first time here? The man looked up at her, a smile in his eyes. He said he came every year. She asked if he painted every year, and he said he did. She rolled her eyes, telling him that was boring. The man just smiled, saying that every year the flowers were a little different. Clara argued that it was still the same scenery. She told him about all the places she had been, the mountains, the rivers, the snow-capped peaks of Patagonia, which were far more beautiful than this. Is your father Senator Reed? He asked. Yes, how did you know? She asked, surprised. Before he could answer, a female attendant hurried over, bowed deeply, and said, Your Majesty, it is about to rain. The First Lady requests that you return to the lodge. Clara's knees went weak. President Sterling nodded. I know. He allowed the attendant to pack up his art supplies. He then said to Clara, Senator Reed has mentioned that his daughter has the heart of an explorer. Clara immediately dropped to her knees. I did not recognize Your Majesty. Please forgive my rude words. The president looked at her with amusement. You may rise. No, I'm fine right here, she mumbled, her head bowed. The president stepped forward and helped her to her feet. The painting is not finished. When I have time, I will summon you to complete it. How does that sound? Clara, still trembling, dared to look up at him. His face was framed by the peach blossoms. Her heart skipped a beat. All right, she said, as if in a daze. The rain came suddenly and stopped just as abruptly at sunset, leaving the ground covered in a carpet of red petals. Caleb Thorne stepped out into the courtyard. He took a small, silver whistle from his pocket and blew a silent, ultrasonic note. A dark-winged drone descended from the eaves. He attached a small, encrypted data chip to it and sent it back into the sky. He was watching it disappear when he heard footsteps hurrying past the gate of his courtyard. He glanced over and saw a flash of a white shirt in the shadows. He frowned, then moved with silent speed, appearing behind the figure. "Attorney General?" The person froze, then turned. In the dim light from the porch lamp, the face was undeniably Julian Vance's. He nodded in greeting. Caleb's frown deepened, then smoothed out into a cool smile. "What are you doing?" The man didn't speak. He looked around, and seeing that they were alone, he pressed a finger to his lips in a gesture of silence, then turned and walked into Caleb's cabin. Caleb watched him, a thoughtful expression on his face. He followed him inside and closed the door, leaning against it with his arms crossed. The man turned and stepped closer, Julian's handsome, scholarly face smiling as he approached. Caleb let him come, his eyes cold as they scanned his face, then looked directly into his eyes. The man looked away, then tilted his head, a slow, deliberate movement, as if he was about to kiss him. He was inches away. Caleb's hand shot out, clamping around his throat. There was a sickening crack, and a small, sharp knife clattered to the floor, falling from the man's white sleeve. He ripped the silicone mask from the man's face, revealing a younger, terrified face, already turning purple. Blood frothed at his lips. Caleb held the mask up to the candlelight. It was incredibly detailed, almost like real skin. He let out a cold laugh. "You can't even get the expression right, and you dare to impersonate Julian Vance to assassinate me." He lifted the man off the ground. "Should I admire your courage, or your death wish?" A choked gurgle was the only answer. The man's body went limp. Caleb dropped the corpse to the floor without a second glance. He held the mask over the candle flame until it melted into a black, foul-smelling lump. He frowned, then strode out of the cabin and headed towards Julian's. He was walking down a long, covered walkway when he saw Dmitry Volkov approaching. The night was deep, the walkway lit by ornate lanterns. Caleb ignored him and kept walking. But as they were about to pass, Dmitry stopped. The humiliation of the archery contest still stung. He couldn't figure out what Caleb had said to Julian to make him perform so well. Spurred by resentment, he sneered, "General Thorne, so busy even at this late hour?" He chuckled. "Then again, for a man as beautiful as you, I imagine it's hard to imagine how you achieved your position." Caleb stopped. He looked at a lantern swaying in the distance. He asked, "Who is your Wenshao to you?" Dmitry was taken aback. "He was my eldest brother." "You admire him?" Caleb asked. Of course, Dmitry said, his voice filled with pride. "My brother conquered entire regions. He made you Americans tremble. He was a hero to our people, even in death." "Death," Caleb repeated softly. He turned his head, his face half in shadow. "Do you want to know how he died at my hands?" Dmitry was stunned. What are you talking about?" "I imagine they wouldn't tell you the whole story," Caleb said, turning to face him. "The deserts of the Middle East. I was able to lead my troops deep into enemy territory without getting lost." "Do you know why?" "Why?" Dmitry asked instinctively. Caleb's lips curved into a chilling smile. "Your eldest brother told me." "Lies!" Dmitry shouted. "My brother would never betray our country." "Then how do you explain that I was never once ambushed in the desert?" Caleb asked, raising an eyebrow. Dmitry was speechless. Caleb continued, his voice low and conversational. "I broke half the bones in his body in under a minute and took him alive. There was an oasis near our camp. I tied him upside down to a post in the water." He looked at Dmitry, his smile deepening. "Do you want me to tell you what that feels like? You don't die, but the water constantly fills your nose and mouth. You have to struggle for every breath. And the salt water seeps into your wounds, a constant, Repeated torture until you don't even have the energy to think about killing yourself. And all the blood rushes to your head. After a while, your eyeballs just fall out. They roll right to your feet. Dmitri stared at the beautiful man in front of him, at his smiling face and the cold, emotionless words coming from his mouth. He felt as if his own lungs were filling with water, his blood turning to ice. He only lasted 2 days. When I cut him down, he crawled at my feet. Do you know what he looked like? Dmitri felt as if his throat was closing up. He understood the implication, but all he could manage was, how could you do that to him? To the victor go the spoils, Caleb said. Your brother should have known that when he ordered the massacres in the cities he captured. He added, the first time your brother saw me, he said something similar to what you just said. That a beauty like me should be captured and passed around among his soldiers for their entertainment. He paused. When he was crawling in front of me like a dog, I asked him, Your Highness, now, do you still think I'm beautiful? Caleb walked slowly towards Dmitri. For every step he took, Dmitri took one back, until his back was pressed against a pillar. Caleb stopped in front of him, leaning in close, his eyes boring into his. He smiled, a devastatingly beautiful, terrifying smile. Your Highness, now, do you still think I'm beautiful? Dmitri opened his mouth, but before he could make a sound, Caleb's hand was around his throat. The smile vanished from Caleb's face, his expression turning as sharp and cold as a knife. Young and reckless, you haven't even smelled the blood of a real battle, and you dare to provoke me. You dare, Dmitri gasped, clawing at his hand. Let go. Caleb leaned in closer, his voice a low hiss. Let me be perfectly clear. The treaty to cede the bases is not negotiable. If every single person in your government agrees to it, I will kill you myself. Another war? Do you think I'm afraid of that? Dmitri's struggles grew weaker. The hand on his throat was like iron. His vision started to black out, his eyes bulging as he stared at Caleb. However, Caleb said, suddenly releasing him, I don't think